in a friend-saturated world, a relationship-saturated world. We're networked all over the place, right? Social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, instant messaging, all that stuff. We're always connected to friends and to other people. If you're on Facebook, and if you're like any normal average Facebook user, the average Facebook user has 338 friends. 338 friends. That's a lot of friends. If you're the average teen and you text message, you send an average of 60 text messages a day, but you receive an average of 1,800 a day. Let that sink in for a moment. That's a lot, right? We are constantly networking, relating, liking, clicking, tweeting, Instagramming. We're sharing our lives out there. We're putting everything about our lives out there for people to share and to interact with. Now, some of you are sitting here thinking, oh wait, here we go. The pastor's going to tell us to get off Facebook. And, I'm not going to do that, actually. I'm not going to do that. But what I do want us to do is to reflect for a moment on something that I think is ironic. Okay? As connected as we are, as linked in with each other on all social media platforms and that sort of thing, some studies show, I think pretty compellingly, that we are becoming lonelier and more disconnected. Slate.com did a piece on this, and actually you don't even need to read the piece do read the piece if you're going to look at it, but the title says it all. The title of the piece was, Americans are increasingly likely to live loveless, lonely existences. And I think there's actually a lot of truth in that. I think as networked and connected as we are, there's also a growing sense of loneliness and isolation, feeling disjointed. And I wonder what that says about our nature. I wonder what that says about how we are made, how God created us. We've been spending our time looking at the book of Genesis, and particularly the first chapter, Genesis 2, what happens when God puts Adam and Eve in the garden, how he makes them, how he wires them, how he creates them. And one of the things that is striking is, of course, that when God looks at everything, he says it's good, actually. We haven't looked much at Genesis chapter 1, but if you were to read through that and take notes every time you read that God says it was very good or it was good, you read it 10 times. God looks at the planets and the rivers and the mountains and oceans and everything, and 10 times God looks and says, this is good. This is good. This is good. This is very good. And then we get into chapter 2, and chapter 2, you may remember, is the same story of creation, but just told from a different perspective, different angle, as it were. And in chapter 2, verse 18, what do we read? This is not good. God looks down at something in his world and says, this isn't right yet. And this is before sin has entered the picture, so we know that this is nothing here is a result of the fall. This is a result of creation that isn't complete yet. God sees that Adam is alone. He's got all these other animals, dolphins and birds and giraffes and elephants and everything else, but there's no other human being. There's no other one like him. And God says, this isn't good. This is incomplete. Something is missing from the goodness of creation. Something is missing. Something is lacking. So what does that say about us? Well, some of you remember the song, what was it, Simon and Garfunkel, right? It's a good song, but it's just wrong. I am a rock, I'm an island, I have no need of friendship. Friendship causes pain, right? Remember that? Good song, bad theology, bad understanding of human nature. We're not made that way. We're not made to be independent, go-it-alone type people who keep people at arm's length and push everyone else away, and I can be independent, just let me be myself. That's not how God made us. Part of our nature is that we are created for relationship. We're created to build community. Now, this text is going to take us into how we understand marriage. But I think we need to see, first of all, that it's bigger than just marriage. God isn't saying here, it's not good that Adam is unmarried. He's not saying it's not good that Adam is single. He's saying it's not good that Adam is alone. So, some of the principles of this text are going to take us right into how we think about marriage. But I think we first need to start by saying this says something basic about human nature, and that is that we are we are created for relationship. Stephen Garber he runs, it's called the Washington Institute for Faith and Vocation, which is a nice mouthful, but a very wise teacher and writer, and he says in one of his books, he's talking about how we're made and human calling and that sort of thing, and he says, we do not flourish as human beings when we know no one and when no one knows us. In other words, to find our purpose and to fulfill our calling in life, we need relationship. We need community. We're built for it. That's how we're designed. That's how God made us. So when God looks down, he sees Adam is alone. There's no one like him. What does he do? Well, he puts Adam to sleep, takes the rib out of his side, and he creates a woman. And in verse 21, verse 22, we read something that makes us almost think about a wedding, because God brings the woman to the man. You almost have that picture of the father bringing the bride down the aisle to meet the groom. That's images there a little bit, I think, and what's happening. God is showing and bringing this woman that he has made, this companion, to Adam, to the man. And when Adam sees her, what does he do? Wow, right? Here's this woman that, he's captured by her. Now, I think in one sense it's fair to say that, he's attracted, okay? I think that's part of it, but I think there's so much more going on here. Adam says, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. He says, this is someone like me. This is someone who's not an animal, not a bird, not a fish. No, this is someone like me. If you go back, there are a couple of verses where our English translation gets it pretty well, but it's one of these Hebrew words. It's in verse 18 and verse 20. English here translates it as suitable, which actually is pretty good, but it's just one of these really, really hard to translate Hebrew words, because literally, if you were to take the word literally, it would be like opposite. There was no like opposite found for Adam. There was no like opposite, and you're thinking, well, which is it? Is it someone like Adam, or is it someone opposite of Adam? Can't be both. It sounds like an oxymoron, right? But if you stop and think on that for a moment, you actually find that that's a pretty good description. What it's getting at is the idea of a complementary partner. Someone who's like Adam in a lot of ways, right? Another human being, it's someone similar in many ways, but also someone who's very different. Now, some of you who have been married here, you've been married a long time, and you know exactly what this is. Some of you have good friends, and you can relate to this, because it's similar in a lot of ways, but then you also know that you see the world differently. You have a different perspective. One of you might be very, very analytical. You think, you process, you problem solve. It's usually the husbands, but not always. I don't want to be too stereotypical, but that's fairly common. And then the other one of you is more, you feel much deeper. You have much more empathy. And together what happens is you have two that sort of like 1 + 1 = 3, because you're far more than just the sum of your parts. You're complementary. Your differences are actually meant to enhance your relationship, not to diminish it. It doesn't make your relationship smaller. At least it's not meant to. It's meant to make it bigger. It's meant to enhance. And that's what Adam begins to see here. This is someone who's like me, but actually different, opposite, like opposite. And then in verse 24 and 25, we read really the last two verses in the whole Bible before sin gets in the way and distorts and damages everything. So we see this picture of what relationship was meant to look like. And again, we're sort of now looking into the nature of marriage here, right? Because God brings them together, and we read that father and mother, man leaves his father and mother, and he's united to his wife, and they cleave together. Now, what do we see here? What do we learn from this? Well, a couple of things. First, look at verse 25. We read that the man and his wife, they're both naked and they feel no shame. Now, our minds right away go to, they don't have clothes yet. They haven't invented that or haven't made that yet. But you know what? What's really happening here, what's really being described is something far more. To be naked is to be vulnerable. It's to be transparent. It's to be intimate. It's to share yourself without holding anything back. It's to be able to be so open and so vulnerable and so weak with another person and not be afraid in any way. It's to be totally known and completely loved at the same time. It's to be intimate on that level, on that you hold nothing back. And that's what's happening here. That's what we're seeing, the intimacy and the depth of vulnerability and love and acceptance here. Right? That's the kind of intimacy and vulnerability that we are made for. And in that context, then man and woman cleave together. Now, that cleave, I mean, we read here, it's united to his wife, which that works too. The old King James, I think, is cleave. I'm going to give you a word picture here that's, you'll probably never forget it after this. And just relax, don't worry, it's nothing inappropriate. It's just, some of you grew up in a cold climate. Some of you maybe, whatever it was, Minnesota. I grew up in Edmonton, and it gets cold there, 30 below zero. And every year it would happen. You get one of the 5th or 6th graders on the playground. They get one of the 1st or 2nd graders that say, hey, come here. And then there's the flagpole. You know where I'm going with this, right? Hey, I dare you to lift that flagpole. And so what do? Then first, no, I'm not going to do that. Oh, come on, are you chicken? Oh, okay. So then what do? They lift the flagpole, and what happens? Your tongue freezes on it. That's cleaving. Now, I want you to know I'm not making this up. There's another place in the Old Testament where you have a soldier, actually. And the way it's described, the soldier's holding his sword, which is metal. And then you read that his hand cleaves to his sword. So it's the idea of the hand sticking to the metal and getting stuck, and you can't tear it apart without bringing about a lot of pain. Now, do you get the sense of why that word is used here? What is meant to happen is that in the marriage context, we're meant to be cleaving to one another. We're meant to be joining ourselves together in that way on every level. Emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually, we're meant to have that depth of vulnerability. And this is something that actually flies in the face of modern culture, because what does culture say? Well, sex is just treated as something you do with your bodies. You separate the body and the soul, and sex is just a physical thing. It's just casual sex. It's just, it's not a big deal. But what Genesis 2 is telling us here is that something happens. You're cleaving with another person on every level of your being. You're joining yourself together in a very deep and personal way, and you can't just casually tear that apart. C.S. Lewis has this marvelous summary of it. I think it's in his book, Screwtape Letters. He says, whenever a man lay with a woman, a transcendent relationship is established that must be eternally enjoyed or eternally endured. In other words, something very deep and very personal happens when we are able to experience this level of vulnerability. You can't be casual, you can't be flippant about it, and some of us actually need to learn to practice this. We need to learn what it means to cleave. Now, I don't just mean physically, because remember, the nakedness here is more than just physical. It's every level. It's emotional. And some of us, that's where we struggle. We build walls. We keep ourselves back from other people. We hold back because we're afraid. We'll get to that in just a moment. But we build those barriers. We haven't cleaved with our spouse. Some of us put our loyalties to our parents before our loyalties to our spouse. And that always seems to come up around this time of year because you've got a lot of family functions that, there's sometimes that pressure. I don't want to let mom and dad down. I don't want to let my parents down. And that can cause a lot of conflict in your own marriage, in your own home, because you haven't cleaved. Some of us, maybe we put the pressure on our kids. Our kids are grown and they're married, but we pressure them. We make them feel guilty. Oh, you don't care about us. If you did, you'd come to us. And you put that pressure. We need to learn and practice what it says here, that they leave their parents and form a whole new entity, a whole new relationship. Right? We interfere. See, God wires us. He's created us. He's designed us for personal, intimate, vulnerable relationship. Now, what happens when sin enters the picture? This is what we were designed for. What happens when sin gets in the way? Well, chapter 3 actually gives us a very clear picture of what goes on. Did you notice that the very last description of paradise says they're enjoying this level of intimacy and transparency and vulnerability. They're naked, they're without shame. The very first sentence after sin enters the picture says that now that nakedness has been spoiled. They suddenly realize that they're naked and now they're ashamed. They hide from each other. They sew these fig leaves together. They're covering up. Right? There's a sense in which one of the very best parts of creation has now become the very worst. Something very, very good has become spoiled. It's become tainted. It's become corrupted in a very, very powerful way. In fact, in verse 12, if you look, this is maybe one of the most shocking verses here. The man, God's presence comes down into the garden. He comes seeking Adam and Eve. And of course, he's not saying, so what happened here? Did I miss something? No, he knows what's happening. He's trying to bring this out, and the presence of God comes into that garden in a very terrifying way. And God begins to ask, so what happened? What did you do? Who did this? And I just want to land on one of the responses. That's what Adam says to God. He says, the woman that you gave me. Oh my. Moments before, maybe verses before, Adam is just overwhelmed with awe at this woman that God has made. And now it's like he hands her back to God and says, she's damaged. She did this. It's her fault. Utter rejection of the good gift that God had given. Adam's trying to turn the blame on everywhere but himself. What's really happened? What is it about their disobedience, Adam and Eve's disobedience, that makes them hide from each other, hide from God? What is it? Well, before sin gets in the way, before sin comes into the picture, Adam and Eve knew the full acceptance and love of God. God knew everything about them, and there was nothing imperfect or incomplete or fallen about them. There was nothing corrupted or tainted in them at all. And so Adam and Eve knew they had the full love and acceptance of God. There was nothing to hide. There was nothing sinful in them. And because they were confident in the love and acceptance of God, they had the security they needed to be vulnerable with one another. And now sin gets in the way. Suddenly Adam and Eve have turned on God. They've turned against him, and they are deathly afraid because they know that God will look at them and he will find them wanting. He will find them broken and sinful. They no longer have the certainty of God's love and acceptance. And when you lose that security, all of a sudden there's a deep need to cover up, to hide from each other. They lose the security of God, and they suddenly lose the security they once had with one another. And that theme of fear and holding back and hiding is still very much a part of a relationship today. Probably every one of us in this room struggles with it to one degree or another. In different ways, different relationships, same struggle. Our deepest fear is that we will be known and rejected. We're created to be known, we're created to be loved, but we fear that if we are known, we will be rejected. People will turn their backs on us. They will keep us at arm's length. They will laugh at us. The Atlantic did a lengthy story on the problem of sexting, sending sexually explicit pictures by text message. It's something that happens at a very young age. And the reporter of this story, I forget the name of the reporter or the author of the story, but she sat down with some young boys and just asked them about this. Why do you do this? How do you go about it? What's it like? Just really kind of exploring the question. And one of the boys answered the question this way, and I say boys because they're 14, 15 years old, so they're young. And one of these guys, they're all out eating pizza together with this writer, and she asked him about it. The young guy said, the boy said, a lot of girls, they're stubborn, so you got to work on them. You say, I'm trying to get serious with you. You call them beautiful. You say, you know I love you. And the next thing you know, you got a picture on your phone. So the reporter asked him some follow-up questions. So then what happens? How does the relationship change after that? Is it, do you get better? Oh no, the boy says, then you see them as trash. See them as disposable. You lose interest in them right away. How sad. To be completely known and to be completely rejected. So the reporter follows up on this and goes to some of these girls and asks them, so what's it like for you? And a lot of them said, we don't want to do this. We feel pressure. We always resist. We don't want to do it, but there's a pressure to do it. And if we don't do it, then we're going to be rejected. So we do it against, we're pressured into it. Finally, we give in. And the reporter says, so then what happens? Oh, one of the girls named Brianna says, oh, he was a jerk. He didn't talk to me anymore. And he just flirted with other girls. Here's someone in a very misguided, broken, sinful way becomes known by another person in one of the most intimate ways and experiences the utter pain of rejection. Now that may not be the way most of us here experience that, but the truth of the matter is, there are some of us here, probably many of us here, that find ways to keep ourselves hidden from one another. You maybe keep your spouse at arm's length. You don't share too much. You don't share too many of your fears, your anxieties, your worries. You find ways to hold yourself back. Some of us here, it's not in the context of marriage at all. It's just that we put up a facade. We pretend to be someone that we're not. We act a certain way because we know if we do, then people will like us. We'll get attention. People will admire us. Some of us put everything on Facebook. And again, I'm not here to bash Facebook too much, but I'm just here to say we put the best part of ourselves on Facebook and we keep the rest of ourselves hidden. What are we doing? We're putting on fig leaves for one thing. We're covering ourselves up. We're covering our brokenness. We're keeping ourselves at arm's length. We're keeping ourselves from relationship, from being known, because we're afraid of being rejected. C.S. Lewis sums this up really in a very profound way. Sort of the human dilemma, what happens, he says, to love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly be broken. If you want to make sure of keeping your heart intact, you must give your heart to no one. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. The only place outside of heaven where you can be perfectly safe from all the bothers of love is hell. Now, Advent is a season of longing. It's a time where we long for the one who came to get us out of this mess, to redeem us, to restore us, so that we can begin to practice and enjoy now what we were made for. And how does Jesus do that? There's another story of another garden. It's told in the Gospel of Mark. Mark chapter 14. We won't read it now, but you can reference it later. Mark 14, 43 to 52. And that's the Garden of Gethsemane. That's where Jesus is just really beginning his final hours. It's where Jesus is about to be arrested and then put on trial and condemned and crucified. Now there's a little detail in that story. What's really happening is In a lot of ways, it's a parallel to what happens here, right? The presence of God comes down into Eden, searching out and bringing a message of judgment. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, really the same thing is happening. The presence of God is descending on that place as Jesus is being arrested, put on trial, condemned, and crucified. There's one little detail that only Mark records for us. It's strange. It almost seems like it doesn't fit. Mark tells us that in all the chaos, there's one young man. Most scholars think it was Mark himself. And he takes off. He's terrified, just like Adam and Eve were. He takes off. He runs away. And here's the little detail that seems so out of place. He runs away naked. He somehow loses his cloak in all this chaos. Now, why would Mark include that? I'm going to suggest that it's because he's drawing our minds back to this story here in Genesis. The presence of God and all of its holiness and all of its terror comes down in the garden, and just as Adam and Eve did, Mark flees. He's afraid. He hides from the presence of God because it's so terrifying. But you know what? There was one who stayed. One who stayed in that garden, and that was Jesus. Jesus stayed in that garden to endure the presence of God. He stayed, he was arrested, he was condemned, he was put on trial, he was hung up on that cross, and on that cross he hung naked and ashamed. Naked in the presence of God, fully known by God. But he was there instead of us. Jesus was known in all of our sinfulness and all of our brokenness. And you know what? Jesus was known by God, and he was utterly rejected. Even Jesus himself cried out to his Father, "Why have you forsaken me? Why have you rejected me?" To put it very simply, Jesus, instead of us, was known fully and fully rejected. Jesus, instead of us, was known fully and fully rejected. Why? So that you and I could be known fully by God and accepted and loved. So that you and I could have and know the embrace of our Father. And that, when that becomes real to us, when we grasp that and by faith take hold of that, that gives us the confidence we need, that gives us the security that we need to be open with others, to be vulnerable, to begin to break down those walls that we try to hide behind. Because we can say, you know what, I'm going to be known, I want to share myself with another person, and there's risk involved, there's often pain involved, but I can know that there is one who will know me fully, and no matter what, he will never reject me. He will never turn me away. And it's in that confidence that you can begin to build those bridges and tear down the walls. We can be vulnerable, we can be transparent in context of marriage, context of friendship, and the context of church community. We are a relationship-saturated world, aren't we? Everywhere we look, people are longing to be known, to be loved. And as frightening as that can be, Jesus has come to make that possible for us. He comes to give us that gift in Christ. Let's trust what God says about us. Let's trust the love and acceptance that God freely offers us in Jesus. Let's pray. Our Father and our God, you search us and you know us. We might think we know ourselves, but Lord, you know us infinitely better than even we ourselves know who we are. You know our deepest, darkest thoughts, our fears, our anxieties. And yet because of Jesus, you don't reject us, you don't turn us away. You welcome us and you receive us. Lord, pour that assurance into our hearts and into our minds. Would you so fill us in that confidence that we're willing and ready to take the risk of knowing and being known, not only by you, but by those close to us. In Jesus we pray.